Chapter 8. Spring Again. Winter was always a busy season for Henry. This year he'd spent some time up in Maine on a big cut, and in the spring he'd happened into a fortuitous arrangement with a stranger from downstate. Henry had had his eye on a 27-acre parcel up in Sheffield, Vermont, that had some wonderful timber on it: spruce, fir, white pine, and some hardwood too. The land was a ridge that divided two different watersheds. The north side of the ridge faced a string of 3 ponds, each cascading into the next, whose waters ultimately would flow into the St. Lawrence River into the Atlantic that way. The south side abutted a large beaver pond, whose outlet stream flowed eventually to the Connecticut River, to the Atlantic via Long Island Sound. Henry had put an ad in the North Country Telegraph, a paper of only classified ads whose motto was, "No news is good news." He'd worded the ad, 12 acres, fishing camp paradise, grandfathered for outhouse, $10,000 for sale by owner. When he'd placed the ad, Henry had not owned the land. He had hoped to attract someone willing to contribute $10,000, with which he could buy the land off the owner, an old widow from New York. Then he would divide the piece into 2 lots, one 12 acres for the stranger, the other 15 acres that Henry would keep for his own fishing camp. Henry would get a piece of land and more than break even on the timber, all for no money of his own spent. The downstater, Stephen Stroh, also worked in the lumber business. He worked the green chain, sorting the lumber onto sleds as it came off the saw, at a small sawmill some 2 hours' drive downstate from where Henry and Emily lived. He'd saved money little by little over the years, and when he'd reached $10,000, which he kept neatly counted in 10 envelopes of $1,000 each, he decided it was time to get his dream, to buy a piece of land he could call his own and build his own fishing camp. He'd hoped that $10,000 would be enough. One Saturday morning he drove his old Plymouth to St. Johnsbury and stopped to have breakfast. At the diner, over his fried eggs, bacon, and coffee, Stephen looked through the North Country Telegraph in the For Sale by Owner Land section. Most of the listings were out of Stephen's price range, but then he saw Henry's ad. Henry's words produced a vision in Stephen's mind of 12 acres of forested land, perhaps at the end of a dirt road, past a large pond with a beaver dam, beavers silently going about their work in the evenings, the dirt road rising to a ridge. The crest of the ridge would be the land for sale. Stephen imagined the other side of the ridge would slope down to an even larger pond, majestic, with clear water, a pebble bottom, trout water. Stephen dreamt on. Across the water to the north would be rocky hills. If he climbed them, he'd be able to see into Canada. He realized he couldn't let his imagination get carried away. Buying land was a serious matter. He'd have to be shrewd and unemotional. As soon as he finished his breakfast, Stephen called the number in the ad. Henry answered. The 2 men arranged to meet at the Lyndonville hardware store. Henry would take Stephen out to the land. Stephen drove up to Lyndonville, got off the interstate, found the hardware store, and waited. Henry drove up in his pickup truck with his Honda 4-wheeler in back. He saw the young man waiting inside the Plymouth with New Hampshire plates. "You Stephen Stroh?" he asked. Yes, that's me. You must be Henry, said Stephen. Yep, get in. Stephen climbed into the passenger seat of the pickup. They drove out to the land while Henry explained the arrangement he'd made with the landowner, omitting only the amount of his contribution to the plan. Sounds reasonable enough. I never thought about how loggers work. That's pretty interesting. I'm just happy to get some land at all. Do you do much fishing? Stephen asked. Some, said Henry, thinking about it. He added, I guess I fish mostly in the spring and hunt in the fall. Same with me, pretty much, said Stephen. They came to the end of the plowed part of the road. Beyond that, the road was not maintained by the town. We'll get out and take the four-wheeler from here, Henry said. Henry drove the four-wheeler with Stephen on the back along the snow-covered trail, which was maintained by a snowmobile club. The landscape unfolded before Stephen's eyes just as he'd envisioned it. A few hundred yards in on the left, there was indeed a large beaver pond, still covered with ice except for the part near the dam. The lodge stood like a snow-capped island dome with a ring of open water surrounding it. As Henry drove the machine, Stephen closed one eye and squinted to blur the other, trying to accentuate the sparkling reflection of the sun on the ring of open water around the beaver lodge. He was able to achieve the effect of the light forming a shiny diamond on the ring of otherwise black water. He saw it as a good omen. There's trout in there, Henry said, after the beaver pond trail rose to a ridge. They drove up to the crest. This is it, Henry said. They stopped, got off the four-wheeler, and walked onto the land. Henry unrolled a laminated topographical map and oriented Stephen to where they were. He had marked the boundaries of the property on the map with a felt-tipped pen. Now this part here, indicating with his finger, is the part I want to log. This part here, where we're standing, is what I want to sell you. Let's walk it, Henry said to Stephen. Henry explained that there would be a tax, the land gains tax, of about $600 that would have to be paid for dividing the land. If you're interested, I'll make a deal with you on the tax. I'll pay it if you let me log your part. If you don't want me to log it, then you pay the tax. That sound fair? Yes, that sounds fair. You can log it, Stephen said. They walked the boundaries of the land. The southern face of the ridge had patches of bare ground. Stephen looked at the sky through the leafless branches of a yellow birch. He watched as a nuthatch walked, facing downward along the trunk of the tree, the only bird that does that, he knew. How carefully it stepped around the strips of peeling bark. Stephen looked south and saw the beaver pond extending into the valley. Beyond the dam, the stream disappeared into a tamarack forest, the trees still dormant, looking like a tan gauze over the snow. They walked to the crest of the ridge. Stephen saw the other pond spreading to the north, a different watershed, a white expanse of snow-covered ice, perhaps half a mile across, a narrow black margin of open water along its edges. Those spray paint marks are the property line. Henry pointed out the marks on the tree trunks. The line followed level along the north side of the ridge, about 100 feet from the edge of the northerly pond. They walked in slushy snow to the far end, following the paint marks to the corner peg, which had an orange plastic ribbon tied to it. They followed the paint marks to the next corner, and the next, until they had walked the whole property. I'll take you back to your car now, if you're I'll take you back to your car now. If you're interested, just give me a call, Henry said. Oh, I'm interested. I'll take it, Henry said. The land was exactly what he'd hoped it would be. Stephen was a little unsettled at just how precisely his vision of what the land would be matched the land in reality. But he kept that thought to himself. He wanted to be shrewd. Henry explained that they'd have to meet with a lawyer to draw up the contract, and for that they'd have to make an appointment. Stephen was even happy to learn that process. The next week the contract was done. Stephen had his land. Henry would have timber to cut for the next winter. The land deal had been made in the spring, 1 year after the first sock had disappeared. The lonely, loyal sock had hung from the alder branch on the edge of the other beaver pond at Fairley Marsh all through the winter. Mercifully, the cold had induced a sort of sock hibernatory state. When warmth returned, the sock awoke, free of memories of the long spell of bitter cold. It had snagged tight to the branch. Even the gale winds of a nor'easter had not dislodged it. That morning, a warm breeze swept across the frozen pond. The snow-covered ice glared. The loyal sock tells it best. At first I didn't know where I was. I felt groggy and disoriented. The sunlight was so bright I could hardly see. But later that day, as the sun lowered in the sky, I was able to recognize where I was. Memory began to come back. The bright white was the snow-covered pond. The snow had melted on the face of what was, I now remember, the beaver dam. Yes, I remember watching the beavers go to work at night before winter set in. How much time had passed? I don't know. It all seemed as if it was a dream. It was in a dream. That night brought back another freeze and another squall. Another freeze and a snow squall. I awoke again, covered with snow, and hoped only to go back into hibernation. But the spell wouldn't take. The spring snows melted quickly in the warm days that followed, and over the weeks, the community of plants and animals that was the beaver pond became busy with activity. Trees flowered. Bright blades of marsh grass poked through the bleached hummocks by the dam. The air pulsed with the courtship drumming of ruffed grouse in the woods. Henry had often pointed that out. A woodpecker, far off, worked on a new hole in a doomed tree. The beavers even worked by day. With nothing else to do, I watched a red-winged blackbird try to land on a dried cattail seed head. What had looked solid enough fell apart into a cloud of downy fluff, and the bird hovered until it could grip the wiry core of the cattail head. Then he began to sing. I'd heard that song before, but it had always been muffled from inside Henry's boot. But this day I heard it clearly, and it was beautiful. It made me feel that the world was alive, and with it I was alive. Even the dead trees were alive. All things emitted energy, an ever-changing radiance I could feel that would tell great stories if it were ever interpreted. It turned out that the red-winged blackbird was building a nest in my very tree, the alder thicket. I couldn't see the nest from my position, but I saw the bird, shiny and black with beautiful red shoulders outlined in yellow. He flew right past me into the tree. His mate was not so colorful, but I saw her too. I looked forward to watching them raise a brood of young. True, I couldn't see the nest. It was above and behind me, but I knew something was happening. It seemed that the female was not leaving the nest. The mail was constantly coming and going. Then one morning I heard a call from the male red-winged blackbird that I'd not heard before. It was loud and sounded like a warning of danger to the female. The male flew to a nearby tree and hopped from branch to branch, calling out this danger call. Then I saw the danger. It was a large black bird, much larger than the red-winged blackbird. It was a crow. I had not known that red-winged blackbirds are afraid of crows, but they are. The crow flew in and landed on my tree just above me. Then Mr. Redwing flew up as if to attack the crow, and in the last second flew off to the neighboring tree. He sputtered unmusical sounds as if he were injured, and perhaps he was trying to lure the crow away from the nest. The crow squatted on its perch, crooking its head to look under the newly grown foliage. It looked intently into the thicket. It seemed to know that with the show Mr. Redwing was putting on, there must be something in there he didn't want the crow to find. Just a second, I have some coffee here. Then Mr. Redwing did one last desperate stunt. He flew right up onto the crow's back and pecked at its head. The crow flew up, irritated but not injured, and perched again on the branch next to mine. Mr. Redwing flew to the nearby tree again. The crow spread his wings. Flapping, balancing on the branch, he steadied himself and turned to face me. Then, as quick as a blink, he grabbed me with his beak, and we flew off, with Mr. Redwing giving chase. We rose high over the beaver pond, up, and over the forest, high above the treetops. We rose so high that the world spread out beneath me, my view extending further and further to distances I had never imagined. I had never known there is so much of this world to see. I could see houses below, and large angular shapes of green grass dotted with tiny black and white cattle. But mostly I saw forests stretching out in all directions to where they touched the sky. The crow held me in its beak and did not speak. From so high up, I saw that the world is actually mostly sky. I had never known that. We passed high over a farmhouse, and I could see it had a clothesline like Emily and Henry had. There was a pickup truck in the driveway. There was a pond. Is that Henry? Emily's house? I wondered to myself. I could barely make out the figure of a person on the porch. Oh dear, is that Emily doing the laundry? It is. I was sure it was. Oh, I'm sure it was her. But I could no longer shout to her than could a mitten. It broke my heart to see her and not be able to let her know. A tearless melancholy took hold of me as I watched the farmhouse fade in the distance. Was it really Emily? I believe it was. A sock is a passive player in the world. A sock doesn't get to decide what it wants to do. I could not go back to Emily and Henry. My partner was gone forever, and I had no idea what fate awaited me in the world of crows. I could only hope that crows don't eat socks. I've heard Henry say that they are omnivores. I hope that doesn't include wool. We flew for what seemed to me like a long time, maybe an hour. I saw no more familiar features in the landscape below. It seemed like endless pine forest and scattered ponds. The crow began leaning slightly to the right, constantly flapping his wings, and began to descend in a great arc. Sometimes we came into a rush of warm air, and we seemed to rise up again, then down again, the arc getting tighter, tightening until I saw below us a red spot in the top of a tree. That spot seemed to be the center of the arc. Then I could make out the black figure of another crow at that spot. The other sock. Ma and Pa Crow had been in and out all day. Ma Crow had been poking around the nest. She pulled me clean out of the sticks and started throwing out old sticks and last year's feathers. She even threw out the big curved stick that Pa had gotten last year. She saved the coat hanger. There I was set over the side of the nest as Ma Crow rearranged everything. It was a sunny afternoon. I was enjoying the day when I saw Pa Crow returning. I could see he had something red in his beak. From high in the sky, he descended, the red object flapping like a cartoon tongue. Ma Crow looked up and saw him. She put me back into place, tucking me into the freshly remodeled nest. She stood on me, so I couldn't see. For some reason, I felt a strange urge to watch as Pa Crow descended. Just what was that? What was that object he was carrying? It was red. It looked like me. No, no, I told myself it couldn't be. Oh dear, I knew I had to control my thoughts. That I could imagine such a thing scared me. Was I really losing control that badly? I couldn't see past Ma. What was it Pa was bringing? I had to know, but I was unable to tell what Ma. I was unable to tell Ma Crow that I needed to see. From the loyal sock again. I looked down to see what was below. I looked down to see that what was below us was the crow's nest. I thought I'd seen a red dot from high up, but now all I could see is the other crow, looking up with obvious anticipation. It struck me that I'd seen the crow as a marauding enemy to the red-winged blackbirds. The crow had swooped in so threateningly, and the way he had been searching the alder thicket for whatever Mr. Redwing was trying to protect was scary. I'd been helpless to intervene. I don't know what will become of me now, but I'm glad that my bright red color was attractive enough to this crow to distract him from committing whatever crime he had had in mind against the red-winged blackbirds. That's how it seemed to me. He wanted to commit a crime. Now, helpless in his beak, with his partner waiting eagerly to tear me apart, I resolved to go down proudly to my fate. Then the other crow stepped aside, and I saw the red again. It was just my color. My wool went numb. I had to see again, but the other crow had moved back, covering the red object. The crow holding me wheeled above the nest and flapped his wings in slow descent for the last few yards. The other crow stepped aside in eagerness, allowing me to see the red patch under her feet. Recognition gripped me like static. The runaway sock. Ma Crow always stepped from side to side when Pa returned from his expeditions, like a dance. And this time, as she danced, I could see why. That red object in his beak was none other than my long-lost partner. I was astonished. And so it was. After 1 year and 12 days, the two red socks were together again. They, of course, had much catching up to do. It was a busy time around the nest as well. Ma Crow, a bird not given to sentimentality, perhaps even indifferent to the drama the two socks felt, put them both side by side in the nest, but spent no time acknowledging their joy. They'd be a delightful bed for her next brood, is all Ma Crow thought. How the two socks came to explain themselves to each other is best told in their own words. As I said in the beginning, as socks, we didn't even have names. In telling any story, it is of utmost importance to know who is telling. So we decided to name ourselves. I took the name Flood, as it was floodwater that delivered me from my past life. And I decided to call myself Alder, after the alder tree that held me through the winter. I'll let Flood tell it for now. He's got such a gift for it. Well, anyway, there we were in the nest. Alder had never been in a crow's nest before. I helped her learn how crows communicate and what was expected of us. Alder quickly learned everything, and I knew. Uh, uh, no, Alder quickly learned everything I knew, and then more. It was pure joy when the first egg arrived. On that morning, just like the year before, the extended crow family gathered round to help. I recognized each of the 5 fledglings from last year. They'd grown big and proud. Some of the 2-year-olds who'd come by last year also came by, and they'd said that the others were all well, but couldn't come because they had their own chicks to tend, said Flood. Alder. Yes, I'd never known what tight family relations crows have. I can't really forgive Pa Crow for what he was going to do to the poor red-winged blackbirds, but I've come to respect that to him, his children are the most important thing. Period. Okay, so here's a picture that goes with the following page. So this is there's both socks in the nest this time. Okay. That season, 6 eggs were laid and 6 chicks fledged, not a single one lost. One summer day, the last new bird of the nest, one summer day, the last new bird left the nest. Flood and Alder found themselves alone, staring up at the sky in a moment of quiet reflection. Alder, as soon as that wind ripped me from the clothesline, I regretted leaving. I had no idea how much I had needed you. It was a tough year. If it had ever been in my power to find my way back to you, I'd have tried, said Flood. I missed you too, more than you'll know. Of course, I was angry at the beginning. I couldn't get over the fact that you must have known that your leaving would mean almost certain doom for me. And still you went. It was from nothing other than Henry's sentimentality that we were spared. But I realized that being angry was silly. I knew that you would never have been able to settle as we were. The urge to escape would have recurred and recurred until it was fulfilled. Everything has its nature. You have yours, I have mine, said Alder. I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? Said Flood. You have lived according to your nature. You don't need to be forgiven. Pa Crow doesn't need to be forgiven for what he was going to do to the red-winged blackbirds. That is how the world is. I love you, and I'm happy to be back together with you. And I have to say, this is a whole lot better than being in Henry's boot. Henry, sweet man, horrible feet. Flood and Alder, the Red Sox, basked the days away in their treetop nest. They enjoyed idly complaining about the weather, watching the clouds above. Weeks became months of languid bliss for 2 socks together, savoring every moment. On a cool September afternoon, the nest swayed gently in the breeze. Fall was in the air. Autumn fair weather clouds drifted in a sky of cobalt blue. Here's the picture of that. Not such a lonely scene this time. Cumulus humulus. I think that's what those clouds are called. Alder? Said Flood. Yes, said Alder. Do you miss Henry and Emily? Flood asked. Sometimes. I love them for bringing us into the world, after all. How about you? Said Alder. Yes, same for me. I hope Henry doesn't suspect that it was his feet I couldn't stand. Do you think they miss us? Henry joked that he understood why you would have run off, that life on his feet would have been miserable. Yes, I'm sure he misses us. I watched him while he hunted. He'd talk to himself, not knowing that I could hear him. He misses us. But that's because we were his first gift from Emily, said Alder. The land deal had been settled in spring. Henry had waited for the weather to cool before he began logging the piece. Stephen Stroh had built a beautiful outhouse downstate, and as soon as the mud season had passed and the snowmobile road was solid enough, he loaded the outhouse onto the bed of his new, used old Ford pickup and delivered it to his land. He'd figured that the outhouse was the most important thing, because the ad had said that the land was grandfathered for an outhouse, but there had been no outhouse to grandfather. So Stephen built one. Because this was going to be the first building he ever built on his own property, he decided to make it the most beautiful outhouse in all of New England. It was framed with rough-cut hemlock 2x4s, sided with white pine V-match siding, discounted on account of blue stain. Stephen saw the bluish coloring in a positive light. He called it the gorgonzola of the lumber world. For the ceiling, Stephen had fashioned curved framing out of plywood to support flexible quarter-inch sheetrock to make a half-cylindrical cathedral ceiling, on which he painted with enamel a likeness of Michelangelo's Creation of Adam, the original of which is on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. But instead of God and Adam's fingers touching as in the original, Stephen's painting had God handing Adam a roll of toilet paper. Stephen was very proud of his outhouse. In mid-October, the first snow fell on Stephen's land. By Thanksgiving, 6 inches of snow blanketed the forest floor. On December 1st, Henry arrived at the land with his crew. Raymond Bigwood drove the pickup with the camper. Kenny Woodbury drove the flatbed carrying the skidder, and Henry drove the grappler loader. They parked and propped the camper level with wooden blocks. When that was done, they stood admiring the view, drinking coffee from thermoses and eating apple pie. After that, they admired Stephen's outhouse. Then it was time for work. Henry would use the plow on the skidder to clear a loading area, while the crew fueled up their saws. Ma and Pa Crow were gone for the winter. Flood and Alder chatted, enjoying the peaceful morning. You know, Flood, I think we've tumbled into a pretty good situation by chance. I can be happy for the rest of my years here with you. I look forward to helping Ma and Pa Crow raise the next brood in the spring. And I have to tell you, we never would have been this happy had you never run away. Fate has a funny way of working things out. I never thought I'd be saying this, but thank you, said Alder. Oh, thank you for saying that, Alder. I love you, said Flood. I love you too. Here we are, Flood, a pair of perfectly good red socks who'll never be stretched onto a human foot again, said Alder. Then the silence they'd known each morning since the chicks had fledged was broken by the familiar sound of a skidder, then a chainsaw, then another chainsaw, and another. The men began to cut. Flood and Alder could hear trees falling, but could only see the sky from inside the nest. The morning went on. All the while, the sounds of chainsaws, falling trees, and the skitter filled the air. By lunchtime, the sounds were very close. Then, late in the afternoon, Henry claimed the biggest white pine of the lot. He sized it up carefully, walking around it to judge the direction in which it must fall. Then he began to cut. A vibration shot up through the tree to the nest. Flood and Alder lay stunned. They knew that vibration. The vibration gripped the two stalks like static current as the saw cut a wedge out of the side toward which the tree would fall. Then, cutting from the opposite side, the vibrating continued and became stronger and more paralyzing. The tree began to sway, slowly, hypnotically. Flood and Alder sickened from the motion and from the shock that what they'd thought could never happen was indeed about to happen. The saw went silent. Henry's voice called out, "Timber!" There was a loud crack. The tree slowly leaned. Then a series of cracks as the last fibers of the trunk gave way, and the tree plunged violently onto the snow as if in slow motion. Henry began cutting the limbs from the tree, starting at the bottom branches of the crown. One by one he cut, pulling limbs away as he worked toward the top. Then he saw a not so rare sight, a bird's nest. In most cases it was crows' nests in these big trees. He did not worry so much about that, as he knew that crows left their nests for the winter. No birds would die from this. Then he got closer, and he saw something red. That was unusual. A shock of recognition shot through him, too. He was still too far off to confirm what this was, and had to clear away the limbs to get close enough to see. A strange feeling grew in his gut. He got within reach, bent down over the branches, and picked up the two red socks. They were red socks, all right, and they looked like his red socks. "Couldn't be," he said. Then he looked carefully and saw that one of them had a piece of shoelace sewed to it. They were his socks, his long-lost socks. "We'll all be! Hey, guys, take a look at this!" he hollered to his crew. He imagined how happy Emily would be that he'd found his long-lost socks. Bigwood and Kenny Woodbury stopped their saws and trudged through the snow to see what Henry had found. The end. Here's the last picture. You can see Henry showing the socks to Raymond Bigwood and Kenny Woodbury.